Hello everyone and welcome back. After many months I am back with another guide, and I have to say sorry and I have to apologize for this, but basically when the new patch came out I kind of didn't play the game. I'm also in the last year of my studies, and I think I just delayed the setup video as much as possible because I didn't feel like it, but that doesn't matter because today I finally did produce it and I want you guys to enjoy it as much as possible. This is my attempt at making the ultimate, the best setup guide, the most long version possible without making it too long. As a proclaimer, like usual, I won't go into detail in as what the individual settings do because many other videos have explained that. I always recommend James Baldwin's setup series or videos from Bushy Ants, or there are actually some new ones from Marcel Kiefer or Jano Opmeer as well. You can go check them out on what the individual settings do and how they work and how they affect the car. We're here to talk about how they are actually applied in the F1 2021 game and how you can set them up so you can league race with your own setup that suits to your own liking. Keep in mind all of these are going to be race setups. However, there's an important difference between a race setup and a league race setup, because you can have a league race setup that has completely different settings for quality and then change a ton of stuff in Parc Fermé. What's that going to be? I will go into detail on that part later. As for the introduction of how we're going to do this, I think we're going to start off with a very short tldnr, a very short too long didn't read. For those who don't want to watch the long version, the long guide, I'm going to say basically all the important stuff in about a minute or so that you need to know to build your own setup, and then I'm going to go into a lot more detail as to why we are using these settings afterwards. So, what should you run? Aerodynamics, you should keep the wings pretty close. In general, most tracks are slightly inverted though, but try and make the difference not too big and not too understeery. Differential hasn't really changed. You want to run 100 on throttle and about 55 off throttle. This can increase if you want to protect the rear tires or decrease if you need more turn-in. Right, left is still a very good baseline. However, there are some adjustments to be made if you want to prevent rear locking or get more grip in sustained high-speed corners. Suspension, the following suspension 15, 15, 17 is a very good baseline that will work on any track. However, if you want more grip over curbs, you should lower the suspension and instead use more aggressive roll bars. 150 on the for the brakes. Always use maximum rear tire pressures in the race, and try to make the front tire pressures as high as possible. If you are locking up too much or you're overheating the front tires, try lowering them a bit, but never go below 23.0 on the fronts. Alright, that was the too long didn't read. I hope you enjoyed it, and you can clip it if you want and send it to other people. I don't really care. We're now going to jump right in as to why this is the case. So, aerodynamics. This hasn't really changed. You still want to run high wings because on this game the drag or the top speed lost through running higher wings is very low compared to the time you gain in the corners. In general, you will want to run high front wing and enough rear wing so that you can use sensible suspension settings, or rather normal suspension settings. What that is, I will go into detail later. This is just to prevent some odd behavior of the car in some corners. So like for example, you could run inverted suspension and run extremely low rear wing, but that will make the car feel very awkward under braking, for example. So to prevent that, you want to keep the wings in general quite close together. To get a general idea of what the aerodynamic settings should be, just go to the time trial setup and look at it, because you can pretty much take the aerodynamics of that setup as a baseline. Maybe you will want to add one front wing or add one rear wing. Both is possible. But in general, the time trial setup in terms of its aerodynamics is fine to take as a baseline and fine to take for the transmission as well. we will always use 100 on diff, mainly because we want to have the maximum initial traction as possible and the least wheel spin when trying to accelerate out of corners. If you run lower on throttle, you will get that wheel spin earlier and faster, but it won't be as quickly turned into a spin. So I think that's the way to best describe what on throttle does, because some people are always a bit confused as to what it does. So basically, when you lower the on throttle, the differential is less locked. The rear tires are allowed to spin at different speeds more while you're on the throttle, which is going to cause you to lose traction more easily. But when you do, it should be easier to control. However, we don't want to lose traction at all, so that's why we're going to keep it at 100. As for the off-throttle, 55 is the baseline that works on most tracks. There are tracks, as I mentioned in the Too Long Didn't Read guide, where the rear tires generally do overheat, so you can increase them by about up to 58. I think 58 is the maximum that you can run on any track. I wouldn't, going any higher than that is not really worth it. You can go lower, but I think in the dry at least, running below 54% is also too aggressive for non-ABS users. For those out there that are using ABS, please use either 50 or 51 off-throttle and abuse the crap out of it. It just makes you faster without any real drawbacks. But this is mainly a guide focused on those that actually do not use any assists. As for the suspension geometry, I mentioned it in my previous guide that I'm going to link down below again, because some parts of it are still valid, some parts I'm going to correct here. This is the part of the setup that you want to adjust at the very end, because it's used to fine-tune the car. So basically, after you've done everything else, you're going to look at this and think about if you want any slight different way about how the car behaves, which is going to give you and your driving style additional lap time. Right, left, left, left is the normal baseline. You will want to reduce front camber if there is a very fast high-speed corner or a long sustained cornering situation at high speed, and that causes your car to over-rotate, but at the same time you feel like you have enough turn-in everywhere else. So then you can lower this a bit, like 2 or 3 clicks. At Silverstone, some people even use like middling front camber. This is going to give you more grip in those long sustained cornering situations, prevent the car from over-rotating in those corners. However, at the same time, it's going to give you a bit less initial turn-in and a bit less aggression throughout those long corners. It's more designed to increase stability, basically. At the same time, rear camber is very useful on tracks like Monza and USA, so Circuit of the Americas, because it has 2 main effects. One is it's going to improve your traction when the car is accelerating in a straight line, so basically out of a hairpin, for example. And it's going to prevent you from rear locking, or help with that, which is going to be extremely helpful on tracks like USA and Monza, as I said, because the rears can lock actually instead of the fronts. Usually you always have a front lockup, but a rear lockup is very possible on this game sometimes with an aggressive setup. And this can help you with that and improve the traction out of those slow corners where the car is sitting straight. At the same time, however, of course, because it helps prevent rear locking, it's going to provoke front locking. So if you're front locking as well on other corners, then you should maybe look at another setting to help fix your issue with rear locking. I still don't hold a very high opinion of front and rear toe. I do think that the negatives of them are very high and do not make it any good, to be honest. That said, front toe is going to give you more initial turn-in. However, if you use too much, it's going to make the car wash out mid-corner, causing you to lose grip mid-corner, which is something I absolutely despise. And it's going to provoke more front locking, and it's going to increase front tire temperatures. Rear toe, it's going to do the same as well. It's going to give you more stability on the back, because it's the opposite of front toe. but it's going to take away your turn-in, and it's going to increase the rear temperatures, and it's going to suck because it feels like you're driving a bus. It's not really that great, to be honest. Avoid rear toe at any costs. You can use 1 or 2 clips of front toe, I think. You can try this if you feel like the rest of the setup is amazing, but you want just a tiny bit more aggression. But generally, just leave it. It's not that great. Now, moving on to the suspension. I proclaimed that 1.5, 1.5, 1.7 can be used at any track, and I still think that is correct. This is kind of a valid baseline that will provide you with enough turn-in, while also having enough stability in both slow and high-speed corners. However, there are tracks or driving styles where you will want a softer suspension and more aggressive roll bars. I generally do not think that running aggressive suspension on rear suspension on this game is very good. It has a very negative behavior on the car, especially out of slow corners. It can make the car very aggressive, and it makes the car quite unstable and harsh over bumps, curbs. It's a bit meh. It's especially because you can't really use ride height to fix it. It's not very good. In general, 1.5, 1.5 provides enough turn-in. And on the rear suspension, I definitely wouldn't go over 1.7. I think 1.7 is about the maximum you can use for rear suspension. Any higher than that, and the car will start to feel like crap. At the same time, if you want the car to be better over curbs, you can use up to, and I think including, 1.1 or 1.2 suspension. I think that I basically mentioned the opposite of this in my previous race guides, but I've come to a change of mind because I actually underestimated on this game as to how well anti-roll bar can give you rotation and how aggressive you can be on the rear anti-roll bar to generate this rotation without making the car very unstable. At the same time, because someone would think that it would make sense to just run 1.11 and then balance it out with inverted suspension, that actually has a negative effect on the car. It's going to provide you with some understeer in some parts of the corner, and then on the exit it's going to be insanely oversteery again, which is going to cost you lap time, mainly because you won't be able to use that. But, for example, if you want to run lower rear suspension and want more change of direction, so if you want more change of direction or more initial turn-in, then it is preferable to run very aggressive anti-roll bars. You can run up to 10 or 11 on some tracks. Brazil is a good example for this, or, well, Brazil actually not really. Mainly Russia, for example. Imola. Probably not on tracks like Portimao or tracks where traction is important. And especially street circuits, you will want to run a softer suspension in general, and that will include the roll bars. But on those street circuits where traction out of slow corners is vital, you will want to run low and soft suspension, so low rear suspension, but also not too aggressive rear anti-roll bars, because on those slow tracks, the main part of your rotation will come from the wings, because you will run like 11 wings anyway on tracks like Hungary, Singapore, Monaco. For the rear anti-roll bars, I think going below 3 rarely makes sense. Like, you can run 3, but then you will have to run higher aggressive suspension, and it makes the car quite understeery. It will provoke increased from tire temperatures and wear. It can feel very, very good for a newer player to drive this, because it's a very stable car while still providing with decent enough turn-in. But in the end, it will cost you some lap time, as opposed to if you would just set it to 1.3, 1.6. Oh, sorry about that one. So, when are exactly the situations that you will want to run aggressive suspension and aggressive roll bars, excuse me, and when will you want to run not as aggressive roll bars, but a more equal setting between suspension and roll bars? Well, the main difference here is gonna be that do you feel any negative effects running insane rear roll bars? This can be either the car will feel undrivable on all tires. It will be very, very skittish, very, very slidey, and hard to control. Or if the track is actually very oversteery in high speed change of direction. Take for example Mexico. These rear anti-roll bars will cause you to spin in those high speed change of directions that are very aggressive, and you will want more stability in those change of directions. But at the same time, you will want enough rotation in other parts of the track. You will want to run lower rear roll bars and, as a balance, up the rear suspension a bit to suit it so that the car fits every corner. However, if, at the same time, if those super high speed changes of direction do not exist, you can run anti-roll bars as high as you like. Be sure to balance it out with the rear suspension though, so basically at the end you always have like a limit of aggression that you can use on the suspension without making the car undrivable. It's personal preference if you put a higher focus on rear anti-roll bars or rear suspension. As for the ride height, I think you will always run 1 or 2 front ride height, in some extreme cases 3, but that's very rare. The reason for increasing the front ride height is mainly if you're at a very, very high speed circuit, because running very low front ride height with under hard braking will cause you to compress the car and lose time, because the air cannot go beneath the car again because you're too low under the ground, and the car is pressed too far down into the ground from the high cornering speeds. Take Japan for example. At Japan, running 2 front ride height is suitable because of those high speed corners in the S's, and because you will actually want to take the curbs in those S's, which is an absolute piece of crap, but it's what you can do. As for the rear ride height, you will want to keep this either at 6, 7 or at 8, and you will have to test this on every track. But basically running higher rear ride height will give you more high speed stability. So if you keep spinning in Cops or in VSs at Mexico or the fast right-hander at China, this is the place where you will want to look to increase the stability for those corners, and you will want to up it to up to 8. If the corners are somewhat middling, so there are some fast corners and some slower corners, you will want to run 7 rear ride height. And if they are mostly slow-ish corners, or if the fast corners are not that aggressive, you can run 1/6 ride height, and this will put the center of gravity as low as possible, which is beneficial for cornering and will therefore be fastest. Running 1/5 ride height will actually make the car unstable even in slow speed corners, so I suggest you avoid that. But basically you can run as baselines 1/5, 1/5, 1/7, or if you will want to run a more roll bar focused baseline, that would be 1/2, 1/7, 1/7, and for slower speed circuits it would be 1/2, 1/6, 1/6. Moving on to the brakes. Now this has changed since the last patch, but I think that's the change that probably everybody immediately noticed. You can run 50% brake bias pretty much at any track. The only time you will want to increase this to 51 is for some dangerous corners. At the same time, I think you should develop your setup to be suited towards 50% brake bias, and then only up it for those, increase it for those extreme corners. And I think I don't need to say anything else about the brake pressure. It's 100. If you don't run 100, run 100 and get used to it. It's the best. Now, moving on to the tire pressures. I first stated that rear tire pressures at the maximum is the very best, and I hold true to that fact, and I'm going to explain now why. Well, first of all, it's going to give you great tire wear, and it's going to give you the best stability, especially in high speed corners. After doing some testing and talking to some people, it basically also means that if you would lower them, you would lose this stability and aggression, and it instead is more beneficial and overall just faster to run maximum tire pressures and just drive around if they overheat. So you will have to adapt your driving a bit, you will have to be a bit more cautious if they overheat, but being a bit more cautious and running maximum pressure will be faster than just sending it and running lower rear pressures. This is not true for the front pressures. If you overheat the fronts, you cannot drive around it. You cannot be a bit more cautious. Being a bit more cautious on the fronts, it's going to lose your lap time, and you don't really want that. So, in general, you still want to keep the front pressures as high as possible, but there are a few reasons as to why you want to lower them. The first reason, your car is over-rotating at high speed. Cops, Luffield, you name it. Those corners, running high front pressures will give you great rotation. However, it can often be too much rotation, so lowering them a bit for to have these corners is going to be good. Second, you lock up a lot, the fronts. Running a bit lower front tire pressures will help you against locking up the tires, because it contributes to them being a bit better, basically, for those situations. It also, and basically it's the same territory kinda, a bit better for a lot of low speed corners to run lower tire pressures, because it's gonna give you more grip and more stability out of the rear. Keep in mind, you will still want to run as high as possible because of the tire wear and the increased rotation. I'm right now again just stating facts as to when you should lower them. The obvious reason to lower them as well is overheating. So if you hit 105 degrees in a corner, while being in the corner, you should lower your pressures. If you reach 105 degrees while accelerating out of a corner, then that doesn't really matter, because they will cool down on the straight and you will have usable temperatures in the corner again. Now, I think this is a good summary of what every setting does and what we generally run. But what do league racing setups actually do to make the car, for example, a bit more aggressive for qualifying, but then still have good settings for the race? So, in order to do that, let's just set up a basic setup. 10-8 wings, 1-2, 1-7, 1-7. And we have these pressures as for standard. Now, you will want to increase the aggression on this setup. What people usually like to do is, for example, for qualifying, just add a clip of front wing. It can be done for Parc Fermé and can be undone in Parc Fermé. So for the race, you can just run 10 again. At the same time, people generally tend to increase their off throttle by 1% in the race to help with rear locking and just in general running a comparatively lower setting in qualifying, because rear locking is very, very rare in qualifying and you will want to have the maximum amount of rotation possible. You generally do not mess with suspension geometry, suspension or brakes for that. What you do change regularly are the front tire pressures, because you could basically run anything you want in qualifying. And as a way to stabilize the car, because we made it more aggressive with the front wing and more aggressive with the off throttle, people generally tend to run lower pressures in quali, which also helps them protect against overheating if that is a problem on a track like Hungary, Spain or Singapore, even in qualifying. So you can run lower pressures. I wouldn't recommend necessarily to run minimum pressures, because that has some bad behavior on braking of the car, because it helps you so much with front locking that it actually provokes rear locking a bit. So that's kind of dangerous, running minimum. So I think running low-ish pressures in qualifying is good if you use more aggression elsewhere, and if that's the important part, if you change it back to your usual setting for the race. Now, I think that's pretty much all of it, and I'm going to thank everyone for your attention. I know it's been long as fuck. I'm going to put it into brackets, and I hope you enjoyed it. As a quick summary, again, the very final time, what do you want to do? You will want to run somewhat equal wings. you'll want to run 100 on throttle differential and about 55 off throttle. Right, left, left, left is a very good baseline. You can run either rather equal rear suspension in roll bars, while always running one front suspension in roll bars, with 1.7 or 2.7 ride height, a bit lower or a bit higher as possible. Or if it suits your driving style more, you can run softer suspension and more stiff rear anti-roll bar. You always run 100% brake pressure in either 50 or 51 for aggressive corners in terms of brake bias. You always run maximum rear pressures, and you change your front pressures between qualifying and race to get you a better grip, and try to run as high pressures as possible, but stop overheating and control your front lockups at the same time. This has been Grund with probably the longest video that you will ever see on F1 2021 setups in your career. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't bore you to death, and I'm gonna see you to the next one, which is probably gonna be on wet setups in about 4 months. Bye bye.